everyone, today I want to dive into a topic that's been on my mind, and that's why I'm scared to replay my favourite games. Now, this video's primary focus will be on story-based games and not so much the addictive gameplay loops found in multiplayer games like Call of Duty and FIFA. I'll touch on these areas but with a different approach later on in the video. Nostalgia. That warm feeling of reminiscing that holds immense power for some. When we think of our favourite games, we're not just recalling pixels on a screen, we're reliving emotions. Think about it, the first time you picked up that controller, the excitement, the challenges, the experience, unwrapping a game from that plastic box, and the new box smell. If you know what I mean, you know what I mean there. Nostalgia wraps these memories in a comforting embrace, making them feel almost sacred, but for some, nostalgia just isn't a thing, and I can also appreciate that. Not everybody will experience the same feelings as me, but what I can do is share my experience, and hopefully you can enjoy them vicariously, if you wish that is. I plan to explore the topic of nostalgia more in a future video, but with that said, why am I afraid to replay my favourite games? For me, when I think back to my favourite games, it links back to good memories I've had with family and friends. My earliest memory of playing games has to be playing on my grandpa's old Game Boy Advance, and that had a plethora of Mario and Bomberman games on them. While I don't play them much today, I still have a sweet spot for them. But my golden age of gaming is thanks to my uncle. He really introduced me to the concept of gaming and showed me how to play games for the first time. He showed me Dragon Ball Z Budokai for the first time, alongside the other millions of Dragon Ball Z games out at that time as well in the early 2000s, and he never let me win. Despite kicking my butt in every game, while it's not fun to lose, I enjoyed spending time with my uncle, laughing and joking and just appreciating my favourite characters from the TV show. I do remember one fight that we had on Planet Namek, and somehow I managed to beat him. FYI, I was just button mashing, it was purely down to luck, but he couldn't accept that he just lost to like a 5-year-old or something. And at the time he was using a third-party controller, and it was like one of those see-through ones where you could see like all of the like motherboard and stuff, really cool looking. Initially he blamed me for breaking the controller because, in fairness, I did used to use that controller because it was the cheaper version out of the two. I don't know why he was using it in fairness, but I guess that's the excuse to why he lost. With that said, I was banished from his room, and at the time I was upset. I went and cried to my nan.
I suggest you stop whining like a little bitch.
And now looking back at it, I can just see that he was a sore loser. While it was quite sad, this memory sticks out to me. This was the only win that I can remember after being pummeled for years on end. It was bittersweet almost, but today I still love the Dragon Ball franchise and the games that go along with it. I also think back to when we used to create silly characters on Soul Calibur and we'd laugh at our creations and then fight with them in the arena. But most importantly, my first real introduction to one of my now favourite franchises, Call of Duty. This was thanks to my uncle. I remember playing Modern Warfare 2 on Skid Row and Favela on his PC with Akimbo G18s, and again, I wasn't any good, but I had fun. Some other big franchises that I was introduced to thanks to my uncle was the beautifully crafted worlds of Final Fantasy and Elder Scrolls, the standouts being Final Fantasy X and Oblivion. Having this exposure growing up led me to enjoy future entries down the line. While I reflect on my introduction to gaming, to some, it may not have been that enjoyable, but I treasure those memories. These foundations have allowed me to build new memories and explore these franchises further. Remember me talking about Call of Duty? Well, nostalgia doesn't really have a time limit. Fairly recently, around 3 years ago, the world shut down due to a pandemic, and during that, Call of Duty Warzone saved many of us. When I think back to those times, they are truly cherished as I got to spend invaluable times with my friends. Something silly like 991 hours, but who's counting?
Come on, let's go.
And while the world moved on, so did Call of Duty. With updates and map changes to Warzone, it made the game that we once loved a bit alien. The recent map updates have failed to capture the essence of the goodness from 2020. While the game has attempted to innovate with both success and failures, I think that we can all agree that the game needed these changes and updates, otherwise it would have died. As much love as I have for Verdansk, I'm sure we can also appreciate the flaws that it had. Most recently, there was the reintroduction of the classic Modern Warfare 2 maps in the Modern Warfare 3 remake. While these maps for the most part look visually better, I can't help but think it's still not as good as the originals way over 10 years ago. But why is that? The mechanics mechanics are mostly better now, but maybe it's skill-based matchmaking that is more aggressive in modern titles that's not making it as enjoyable as it could be, but that's a debate within itself. This leads me to my next point. If Verdansk was to drop tomorrow, would I still have as much fun and relive all of those nostalgic memories I had with my friends? Probably not, which scares me, but that's for a range of factors which I want to dive into further today. I will explore single-player games such as remasters, alongside touching on multiplayer games which failed to capture the essence of the times past. As technology advances, so do game mechanics. What once felt groundbreaking might now feel clunky or even outdated. Adapting to these changes can be a challenge. I think live service and multiplayer franchises are the best examples of these, as they are very modern and millions have access to them. For example, look at the movement in Call of Duty or any other FPS over the years like Medal of Honor or Battlefield. I think we can all agree that over time, the movement has got more refined and better for the most part. It allows people to pull off some crazy moves as well. Who doesn't love a good montage? Something that's possible in today's age probably wasn't available in Call of Duty 2, for instance. Do you remember the time in Call of Duty where you couldn't look down at your legs? And Battlefield was revolutionary because you could? It's small changes like this that we probably take for granted or don't even notice. Outside of multiplayer games, the evolution of survival horror games is another great example of the evolution of gaming mechanics and graphics. Resident Evil being one of the first to set new boundaries, with improved camera angles and 3D rendering. Obviously, the classic games provide a prime example, but most recently, Resident Evil 7 actually switched up the entire dynamic of the franchise from moving from a third-person game to first-person. And it was, for the most part, well received. It saved the franchise, some might say. Alongside this, older Resident Evil games used tank controls, something that I'm not too familiar with, whereas the newer games lean on a more generalized controller scheme that pretty much every modern game has. For some, Resident Evil 4 holds nostalgia in many hearts, but some people just aren't a fan of tank controls and can argue that it may actually ruin a revisit to the game. Or you're like me and you've never actually played Resident Evil 4. I know, I suck.
Oh, brother, this guy stinks!
Is it worth playing a graphically dated game with tank controls which I don't even understand, or a shiny new remake with controls I do understand? But I can say, from playing the Resident Evil 2 and 3 remakes without playing the originals, again, I'm sorry, but I had a fantastic time. And I'm sure if you originally played these titles, your opinions could differ, but to me, that was the optimal way to play. But what about my favourite games? One game that I can talk about with confidence and sticks out to me and probably deserves its own video is Far Cry 3. This originally came out in 2012, and I'll be comparing Far Cry 3 and Far Cry 3 the Classic Edition, which came out in 2018, which is essentially just a remaster. With respect, this remaster was arse cheeks. It was a clunky mess. So for me, Far Cry 3 came out in 2012, and I remember I had it on my Christmas list and I was so ecstatic to receive the game from Santa that year. I knew of the franchise from my school friend Ben. He ranted and raved about how good Far Cry 2 was, so logically, Far Cry 3 would be a good place to start. I fell in love with the game, the characters, and I became fully immersed into the frightening world. A villain that truly scared me, and I'm sure there's an argument here for why he's one of the best villains in video game history. This game was fairly revolutionary. It was the first in the series to use the new Duna 2 game engine, I hope I've pronounced that right, and this allowed for greater rendering features. Far Cry 3 so you take control of Jason Brody in what I thought was a fantastic open world game with plenty of side quests and collectibles to immerse yourself in. There was a plethora of ways to travel via land or air, and as a 13-year-old this absolutely blew my brain, especially the healing mechanics, where you would literally fish bullets out of your injured arm, cauterize any wounds, and relocate dislocated bones. It was gruesome, and I loved it. These features are fairly common and taken for granted nowadays. We don't even blink twice. I can understand for many, myself included, that Far Cry 3 set a fantastic standard for future games. Whether they lived up to these expectations is a debate in itself. I think back to these nostalgic memories and almost think it was a fever dream. I obtained the platinum for Far Cry 3 Classic Edition as part of my 30 platinums in 30 days challenge back in September. I've always wanted an excuse to jump back into what I thought was one of my favourite games. I knew graphically it didn't look the best, so I was naturally put off. Some months before I actually attempted this challenge, I did actually load the game up and I played through the opening sequence, upon which I closed the app and deleted the game. It looked awful and the controls felt even worse. Some months later, after a re-download and an attempt on the platinum, my thoughts that I had prior were right. This game was a clunky mess. The controls were slow, the graphics weren't great, but that was something that I was willing to look past because it was an old game technically. Climbing the radio towers was purely down to luck. Sometimes I would attempt to climb or jump and completely miss it, or just not go where I wanted it to. I respect that all games from this era have greatly improved their mechanics, but wow, did I really endure this pain back then. Maybe because it was one of my first good open world experience with a fantastic story that truly gripped me, I ignored these factors that are probably quite annoying now. The final nail in the coffin for me was the driving. I cannot comprehend how bad this was. The steering felt like it was weighed down by sandbags and the car had no wheels. What made this clunky horror show even worse was the fact that I had to somehow traverse through this plague-infested island for collectibles in these vehicles. But I do understand I endured this torture for a platinum. So it's kind of my own fault that the memory is now somewhat muddled. Fast forwarding to newer Far Cry games, I can appreciate the evolution of these mechanics and also graphics. But for me, sadly, upon my revisit to what I would have considered one of my favourite games growing up, this joyful memory is now tainted with this newer memory, that of a bad experience. It did make me think, was the game always this bad? Being young, I didn't really have the eye of a critic or exposure to many other great games. I'm sure there's many reasons that could be argued, but this certainly haunts me whenever I think about replaying games. I do want to say though, for the record, that you shouldn't let one bad experience, whether it's gaming or real life, put you off from anything that you're trying to do, whether that's something new or even something old. Just go for it, and I'll touch more on this later. The leaps in technology have given us stunning visuals, but it can also alter our perception of older games. Do our foggy memories hold up against the glossy sheen of today's graphics? Another big influence my uncle played in my adolescence was me observing the crazy worlds of Final Fantasy. I grew up watching Final Fantasy 7 and Final Fantasy 8, but Final Fantasy 10 and 10-2 was the standouts for me. I was besotted by the characters and the worlds. I just fell in love. While I have played all of the modern day Final Fantasies, I can't help but think I just wouldn't enjoy the older games such as 7 and 8. They are on my backlog to visit, but while I do not have a direct gameplay experience and only an observation, I'm not nostalgically driven to play these, strangely enough. I'm fluent in all of the stories, so don't see much value in playing the games. I know all of the major plot points, so some things that are shocking wouldn't even raise my eyebrow. I think I'd also struggle due to the older mechanics as well. I'm not the most familiar with turn-based JRPGs. The oldest Final Fantasy that I have actually played was Final Fantasy X, and I recall fun memories of playing Blitzball. Now, as an adult, I can see how difficult this mode really is. While my memory is cloudy on this game and I don't remember much from playing it as a child, I just remember that it was cool. And this one random line from Tidus. Only kidding, it's this one here.
I had made it out of the frying pan and into the freezer.
As an adult, I decided to attempt completing my first large Final Fantasy game, with the exceptions of Final Fantasy VII Remake and Crisis Core. I decided to play the remastered or the HD collection of Final Fantasy X and X-2. While I wouldn't define X as my favourite Final Fantasy, I definitely thought it was cool, and it still is, which is basically the same as being my favourite, right? However, one day, I just stopped my playthrough through Final Fantasy X. I was about halfway through, I was in some snowy mountains, and this is where the comment section tells me that that's not even halfway through, but I digress. I was a decent chunk of what I thought into the game, and I randomly stopped playing, and I just haven't been back since. I can't explain it. I don't have a negative perception of the game, I just kind of got bored, I guess. Funnily enough, I'm very much in the camp of I'd love to see a reimagining stroke remaster of Final Fantasy X in the same style of the Final Fantasy VII remake, which is really strange. I'd also like to see Final Fantasy VIII done. It's really weird that I want the games to be remade, but I'm too scared to go back and play the originals. It's a very big moral dilemma that I need to work through. But one of the reasons for this is that I think that modern games suit my playstyle more. While some despise the changes that Final Fantasy VII Remake has made and how it does differ from the original, I thoroughly enjoyed my experience in the Final Fantasy Remake Part 1. There it danced. This new, almost alien-like beauty. It's like seeing an old friend after a glamorous makeover. That's Final Fantasy VII Remake in a nutshell. For me, however you want to phrase it, Final Fantasy VII or Final Fantasy VII Remake, it's one of my favourites that I've played. Some honourable mentions though are Crisis Core and also Final Fantasy XVI. But these remasters and obviously 16 are still fairly new, so while they are my current favourites, sort of going back and playing them probably isn't going to elicit the same nostalgic memories that I'm talking about in this video. So why haven't I replayed the original Final Fantasy VII? The reasoning for why I've never played the original is down to what I think is two things. Despite being very familiar with the story, and I do know that the remake is a retelling, so some story points could change as it's being made because it's still in development, the part 2 and part 3, I want to experience Final Fantasy VII for the first time in a way, despite knowing everything about it. So by me playing Final Fantasy VII, the original from PlayStation 1, and I know they've remastered it, but I feel like I would kind of ruin it.
You're just ruining it!
And change my perception of the new remake that I'm playing through. It's strange, right? And I think that because graphically it just doesn't appeal to me, and also the difficulty and the vast scale of the game kind of scares me a bit, alongside the classical turn-based JRPG aspect, which I'm not that familiar in. I just think I would really struggle playing Final Fantasy VII and also Final Fantasy VIII in fairness. I fear that by starting these games up, I could create a negative memory, and this could ruin my judgment for the future remake installments. Maybe once all of the remake installments are out, I can actually go back and play Final Fantasy VII. A genuine concern of mine is, what if replaying a beloved game reveals all of its flaws and diminishes the magic? As I mentioned earlier, Far Cry 3 wasn't the best for me, and in truth, I tried to play another game that I really loved growing up. That was Assassin's Creed 2. I went back and I played the remastered version on PlayStation 4, and again, I played the opening sequence. Even with my rose-tinted glasses, I decided to close the app and delete the game. This was in fear that one of my favourite games from the franchise was going to be ruined. Again, I put this down to the older mechanics and it not being that good on the eye graphically either. There's a plethora of games that I'd love to revisit, but there's this looming fear that by revisiting them, I might expose the imperfections, the quirks that my nostalgic lens conveniently glossed over as a youngster. Is that really such a bad thing? Maybe I could play these games from a new perspective, learn to enjoy the clunky quirks and admire how much gaming has evolved. The bottom line is, I'm scared to destroy my childhood. So how do we navigate this? It's all about finding balance, acknowledging the magic that might be there, it might be different, but regardless, it's still valuable. Maybe I can approach games with an open mind, accept that the experience might not mirror the past exactly, but it can still offer new insights, a different kind of magic. For instance, I loved playing Skyrim growing up, and so did Bethesda with their multiple re-releases of the game. It's as bad as Grand Theft Auto 5. One drawback to me is that the game just felt a little bit outdated upon a quick revisit to it, and sad to say that most of my favourite games feel like this. I would really love to play The Last of Us again. I haven't played it since its original release on PlayStation 3. Again, I had a brief look at the intro section of The Last of Us Remastered and closed the app and deleted the game. I'm scared that I may not enjoy it, and this seems to be a common theme with me. One solution which may work is playing the most recent remake or reimagining of the game. While I begrudge paying money for something I've already owned and experienced, I know technically this is kind of different, and I should probably just get over myself and try to enjoy what I thought was an awesome game growing up in a new form. Maybe I need to accept the memories for what they are and look to create new memories and start again, being grateful that it happened, but not dwelling long enough to ruin my stay. Let's dive into some wider examples. With a quick search on the internet, I don't think I'm alone in not wanting to replay my favourite games. Let's dive into how some of our games succeeded or even struggled when revisited in the modern era. The Grand Theft Auto Definitive Edition, Warcraft 3 Reforged, and Tony Hawk's Pro Skater HD are some honourable mentions to poorly received remasters by the community, and these failed to capture the beautiful feeling of nostalgia. For every action, there is an equal and opposite reaction, and here are some games that were well received. The Uncharted Collection, the Mass Effect Legendary Edition, Call of Duty 4 Remastered, Final Fantasy X and X-2, and recently the Resident Evil remakes 2, 3 and 4. All of the games mentioned are subjective, and I only mentioned them as from my research these were the games that I kept coming across from multiple sources. I'll go on record here and say that remakes have an unfair advantage or disadvantage to remasters. This is because remakes delve further into the games than ever before. Look at the new Dead Space remake. That has delved so much deeper and expanded on some sections than the original did, and a lot of people really enjoyed the remake. And while I've not played all of the games on the list above, I have actually played some, and I just want to present my personal experiences with these games. Within the Grand Theft Auto Definitive Edition, the standout there for me is Grand Theft Auto 3. This was the first Grand Theft Auto I played. I have memories of stealing Banshees and doing the firefighter missions and much more, but going back to the collection, momentarily it was fun, but it's hard to ignore the brilliance of Grand Theft Auto 5, which definitely clouds this definitive collection, alongside all of the bugs and issues with the launch of the game that really didn't help things. As I mentioned earlier, Far Cry 3 just felt clunky. Maybe as I knew the story, it just didn't hit the same. But on the other hand, I've recently revisited the Walking Dead Telltale games in a retrospective video, and while I acknowledged the graphical flaws at the start and knowing the story off by heart, for season 1 especially, I still thoroughly enjoyed my playthrough, and all I can wonder is why. Fundamentally, are some remakes just better than others? Or does memory and rose-tinted glasses impact this more? Did I catch a good whiff of nostalgia? What's going on? Heavy Rain. Jason! A title in my mind that I enjoyed playing when I was younger, but once you experience the twists and turns of that story, it's kind of hard to revisit. Upon my replay of the game, it felt extremely slow to start, and again, I abandoned it mid-playthrough. One delightful HD collection, however, was the Dragon Ball Z Budokai HD collection, and this was a blast, being able to fly around the world and play as some of my favourite characters again. While the story isn't much and you know what you're getting, the fighting aspect was still fun and my nostalgia was satisfied. I put this down to a good, addictive gameplay loop. Maybe there's a hint of nostalgia here, but it was very short-lived. I can imagine if I had to play it for a prolonged period of time, I probably wouldn't have enjoyed it as much. The Uncharted series. This is critically acclaimed for how good it is, and I agree. But when I played through the first couple of the games, to me it just highlighted how flawed the free running mechanics were, and that really took away from the fun, especially when you're playing on harder difficulties and you're trying to make a jump and you just die and the checkpoint resets. It's awful. Uncharted 2 was my first ever PlayStation 3 game, and again, if I had a tier list, I would put this near the top with some of my favourites. As much as it holds a close space in my heart, revisiting the game just wasn't the same for me. And maybe I'm a sad old man, and maybe if I could wipe my memories and play it again for the first time, I'd have enjoyed it more. But the fact is, I didn't. While I tried to be positive, I cannot ignore that I've had more negative experience when revisiting games. Maybe once you've experienced a life-changing story, it doesn't have the same effect as it once did. Maybe the type of game you revisit matters, or who you play them with matters. Was your emotional state the same as a previous playthrough? Probably not. The innocence of being a child probably clouds this as well. As an adult, I'm conscious of time and how valuable it is, a concept that was foreign to me as a child. As an adult, I'm lucky enough to have a wide selections of games that I can afford. As a child, I was mostly limited to birthdays and Christmases, and that's when I'd get some new games, and I truly cherish them all year round. The sooner we understand these memories are just memories, maybe we would be less scared to revisit a game. Having that acceptance that it's okay to like a game less now than you once did is fine. It's scary, I know, but you're not alone. Sometimes I'm just satisfied with the playthrough that I had, especially if it's a linear game with only one ending. Why do I need to play it again? Sometimes maybe we should just take the solace of an amazing game and leave it there in our memories. One area of gaming that I'd like to touch on is the fairly modern free-to-play live service games like Battle Royales. While I would deem some of these as my favourites, there's a clear difference between an addictive gameplay loop and the memories associated with witnessing a life-changing story in a game. I went back to revisit Fortnite OG. I had some brief fun, but I thought this would be a lot better playing with friends. The same goes for modern Call of Duty multiplayers. The game chat aspect of trash talking is very rare now due to party chat functionalities, and while skill-based matchmaking has had a positive effect for most, others find it unenjoyable. The class system has changed from pick 10 to a more elaborate system. Do you remember Call of Duty Black Ops?
It was perfect. Perfect. Everything, down to the last minute details.
Another game I watched my uncle play for months on end, getting the odd game here and there when he would let me and absolutely ruin his KD. As alluded to earlier, I wouldn't get many new games until birthdays or Christmases or saving up for a long period of time. Call of Duty Black Ops came out sometime in November, and that meant that I had to wait over a month from its release until Christmas Day. And this game was at the top of my Christmas list, frantically searching for a box-shaped present under the tree. Sadly, I didn't find any. I'll be honest, I was moody and an ungrateful teenager. I've had some great gifts on that day, but the game was at the forefront of my mind. I didn't get the game. I was devastated. Later that day, we headed to my grandparents where again, we exchanged more gifts. I'm sure you can guess what the gift from my uncle was. It was no other than Call of Duty Black Ops. And while it's probably no shock to you watching this video, to me, I was completely blindsided by this. As you can imagine, as any smelly teenager, I was so happy with this game. While this memory has its highs and lows, the game of Black Ops itself remains at a constant high for me. One of the few games which I've bothered to reach the Master Prestige. The campaign was amazing, the multiplayer was amazing, and the zombies was amazing. But I can't help but think, if we got Black Ops, or even a Black Ops 2 remaster, exactly the same, just a copy and paste in 2023, would we enjoy it? Probably not. We've come so far in gaming, and mostly for the better. Look at COD 4 Remastered. Now that game was fun to revisit, but it badly blended in the modern aspects of today's games, such as loot crates, and it didn't really feel as authentic as it could have as a result. I fear that any classic game would be tainted by this in this loot box culture we now live in. As much as I'd welcome more remastered ports of older Call of Duty games, why don't we put more faith in modern titles and embrace modern gaming? Maybe we should just accept nothing was the same. Just to circle back to my earlier point on Fortnite OG, there were record player count numbers associated to this, and I can only hope that this influences Call of Duty to allow players to jump back into Verdansk by re-releasing the map. I respect life is different now, but I'm interested to see, will it really be the same? Change is inevitable, and that includes our beloved games. Let's embrace it, appreciate the journey, and maybe even find joy in both the old and new. Throughout this video, I've shared some close personal moments and a rediscovered appreciation for these memories. I'm forever grateful for these and honoured that they can be stored almost as a time capsule on YouTube. Forever. To my Uncle James, I'm forever grateful for the many hours we would sink into video games in our youth. Hopefully, this journey may have evoked some positive gaming memories for you. Revisiting these classics might not recreate the past, but it can offer a unique experience, a chance to appreciate the journey of gaming, a chance to show the next generation our favourite games, which can be viewed from a new perspective, a fresh set of eyes. In the end, revisiting our favourite games is a journey. It might be scary, but it's a chance to rediscover, appreciate, and maybe even create new memories. Thanks for joining me on this exploration. I'd love to hear your thoughts and experiences in the comments below. Until next time, happy gaming.